So while I was out on vacation over the holidays, it feels like a lot of news came out about how so many different games developers are announcing that they either are currently using generative AI or are planning on using it in their games moving forwards. You've got games like Where Winds Meet, which has been very popular and it's using LLMs like ChatGPT to roleplay as a number of minor background NPCs in the game. You've got some studios like Crafton, the saviors of Hi-Fi Rush, announcing that they want to become an AI-first company. Even some beloved studios like Larian, the makers of Baldur's Gate 3, saying that they're starting to adopt it into their own development pipeline. And of course, even Sandfall Interactive, the creators of the nearly universally beloved 2025 Game of the Year winner Expedition 33, also got into some hot water recently over the fact that there was some generative AI usage found in their game as well, to the point of getting disqualified from the Indie Game Awards over it. And so naturally, I feel like I've seen a lot of people trying to make excuses or justifications for why using generative AI in games development is actually okay or not as bad as it sounds, especially when it comes to a game or a studio that they clearly already love, like people love Larian so much thanks to Baldur's Gate 3, especially with how they were decrying some of the blatant corporate greed that goes on elsewhere in the industry. So for some people like myself, it can be heartbreaking to see them joining in on this AI craze just like all of those other greedy developers. And instead of being disappointed, there are people that are now trying to bend over backwards to justify it in some way, even though, let's be honest, if this announcement was coming out of any other company like Ubisoft or EA, there would be a much less favorable response to them using it. Though, to be fair, since I started writing this video, it does seem like Larian has started to back down on their AI usage after their Reddit AMA, at least a little bit, so that's nice, even if they haven't sworn against using it entirely. But yeah, to be frank, no matter how much I personally love a studio or a game that they've made, at this point, I don't really think that there is a good reason to jump into using GenAI in game dev for a wide variety of reasons, no matter how minor the use case. To start with, there's a couple of big general reasons that I feel on their own should probably be reason enough to not want to even touch AI technology in the first place, regardless of what you're using it for. For one, it's absolutely laughably god-awful for the environment. Like, these AI corporations are building these massive data centers all over the place, and they consume, frankly, absurd amounts of electricity and water. It's gotten to the point where just the water being consumed in the various water coolers for these data centers has already surpassed the amount of water being used by the entire bottled water industry globally. And the overall carbon footprint of these data centers is kind of like having a second New York City, except for it only exists to serve generative AI. I mean, they're directly responsible for the rising prices of computer components like GPUs and RAM, which has like quadrupled in price over the last few months, and the electricity costs alone are putting such a huge demand on the local power grids that it's causing everyone in the area's electricity bills to go up. Not to mention that all of the excessive electronic waste that is created from burning out all of those computer parts at record pace, just like the good old crypto days of yesteryear. My point being that even if AI was actually a super good and useful technology for game development or otherwise, would you really want to be supporting this technology when it's so incredibly excessively wasteful? Like, I've seen some defenders try to argue, like, oh, well, if you zoom out at the grand scheme of things, like, compared to the entire airline industry, its carbon footprint is relatively small. But it's like, come on, man, like, does it suck that the airline industry is also bad for the environment? Yeah, sure, of course, but at least the airline industry is providing a massive, useful service for humanity. Like, people gotta travel places. It affects international shipping and all kinds of industries in important ways. Meanwhile, generative AI is barely even good at doing what you ask it to do, and is yet to really prove itself as viable in almost any industry. And it's also this insanely, incredibly wasteful. Like, yeah, I don't really see how this is worth the environmental cost. But even if you don't care about the environment for some reason, there's also the ethical cost in regards to copyright and plagiarism. I mean, this technology can literally only work by training it on millions of pieces, if not billions of pieces, of actual human-made artwork and data. And no, it's not the same thing as a person taking inspiration from other human-made art, because these generative AIs, no matter how it looks when you talk to ChatGPT, are not in fact actually intelligent. They are fundamentally incapable of understanding anything they do or what they're thinking. It is literally just a statistical prediction algorithm that uses all of this human-made art to try and predict what the next line of text or the next group of pixels should look like based off of the last group of pixels or line of text. It is effectively just mashing together its training data in a massive collage to try and imitate something human-made, and this fundamental lack of understanding is also crucial to why these generative AI programs tend to hallucinate such random garbage so often, which I'll get a little bit more into detail with later, but needless to say, this causes a lot of problems when you actually try to use it for any kind of real professional work. But okay, so those are a couple of very good general reasons why you really shouldn't be using generative AI in the first place. But let's pretend that these problems somehow get addressed and solved. Maybe they come out with a version that's less bad for the environment or whatever, or they manage to train it only on ethically sourced data somehow. Let's instead now take a closer look at the specific use cases that some developers have talked about so far, because even when we zoom in to these specific tasks, I still don't believe that generative AI has a place in game dev due to its inherent flaws and the way that people are using it. To start with, let's talk about Sandfall Interactive, the aforementioned creators of Expedition 33. Now, they got in some hot water when it was discovered that one of their placeholder textures they were using not only slipped into the final product, but that it was also clearly generated by AI. Now, some people try to give them a free pass, pointing out that they were only using AI for placeholders, and none of it was ever intended to be in the final game. And I mean, I can at least acknowledge that using generated assets only behind the scenes is at least not as bad as shoving it in your players' faces, but I could still not enjoy either practice in the first place. Here's the thing, placeholder textures and sprites and, all the things like that, they literally only exist so that an object has something to render so that it can function in a scene for testing purposes. The quality of the placeholder is completely irrelevant to what it's used for, and if anything, making your placeholders look good is just a waste of time. It can actively make your job harder down the line. I mean, just take a look at the placeholder card art in Slay the Spire. Yeah, it looks hilariously terrible, but that's fine. The point is that it's not meant to be in the final game, so it doesn't matter what it looks like. But, oh, I can hear some of you say, well, it's not like I'm wasting much time generating my placeholders with AI, so what's the harm with that? Well, this is literally the reason why that placeholder art got left in when Expedition 33 was released. Placeholder art being bad is actually a feature. When your placeholders are bad, that makes it so that when you're browsing through all of your game's art files, it's a lot easier to immediately recognize what has and has not been replaced yet, so that you can quickly and easily go, oh, I still need to swap out that texture file or whatever. But when your placeholders look good, or at least a lot closer to what the final artwork is meant to look like, well then suddenly it's a lot harder to quickly notice that it's a placeholder. It might be obviously not in the final art, like if you look at it closely, just like the texture in Expedition 33, but when you're in game dev and you're browsing through hundreds if not thousands of texture files to try and look for the last few placeholders that need to be replaced, you're going to have a lot harder of a time finding it compared to, say, the Slay the Spire art, which I think would be a lot easier to find all of the placeholders even while you're browsing thousands of cards. So using AI to generate good enough placeholder art actually makes your job harder down the line when it comes to replacing it. And I can even see a version of events that causes you to not even bother making the replacement texture in the first place. After all, if it looks good enough at a glance, especially if it's only for something minor like, oh, I don't know, a newspaper stand, and you only see it like once, or maybe it's like a generic rock texture or something, well then you might end up deciding to put off working on the replacement for that texture until later, focusing on bigger, more important textures in the meantime. But if you keep doing that because you have all of these generic AI textures that are at least good enough for now to not worry about it, well then you might end up eventually just forgetting about replacing them entirely, And depending on the quality of your documentation, you might not even realize that they were the placeholders in the first place after enough time. And like, even if you don't run into that issue, like if you end up keeping delaying replacing these textures over and over, you might just literally end up running out of time to make the proper textures and end up having to settle for the quote unquote good enough AI placeholders in and end up putting those in the final game. And now suddenly you've gone from swearing to have no AI textures in your final product to having numerous AI textures all over the place either way. And I mean, let's be real, is this even saving you that much time in the first place? Again, look at the Slay the Spire placeholders. A lot of these could have easily taken seconds to just doodle out, and it's not like you need to waste the artist's time drawing these because again, the quality literally doesn't matter. This is the definition of programmer art. So it's like, either you spend a few seconds drawing some bad placeholder art that would be easier to find and replace down the line, or you spend a few seconds getting the AI to burn down a rainforest to make your placeholder art for you, and potentially end up wasting more time down the line trying to find it to replace it later. So using AI for placeholder art in the first place is just an inherently bad idea. Oh, and as an aside, I just want to say that I am willing to give Sandfall Interactive a pass on using AI for their game, not because of how minorly it was used for all of the reasons that I have just laid out so far, but mainly because, according to them, they only toyed around with AI in the first place back in 2022 when all of the tools like ChatGPT and Midjourney were still brand new. Because let's be honest, back when those tools first came out, nobody really knew what was happening, it was all very sudden, and the vast majority of people didn't really know how it worked, or let alone what the ramifications would end up being down the line. Like, they hadn't really started cranking out these AI data centers like crazy just yet, and the vast majority of people were grossly uninformed on the nature of how these programs functioned. I mean, like, hell, even I myself saw generative AI as a novelty back then. Like, obviously I have now massively turned against it in the modern era, but at the time, I have to admit that I was toying around with it, for making shit posts with my friends, not in any kind of serious professional context, but, stuff like the classic Will Smith eating spaghetti thing. Like, it was a funny thing to generate random shit posts to laugh at. So, in my opinion at least, this is one of the only good reasons to excuse someone for using generative AI. But obviously that is a very limited time offer that only works for the times that people were using it in 2022 up through maybe 2024 at the latest, which of course, due to the lengthy nature of game development, means that there are likely still a handful of games that are going to be coming out in the next few years that will have been using AI during that sort of introductory period. But I think that by now, all of the downsides and the problems with AI have become so well known enough, and that the technology as a whole has become so unpopular, that you can't really feign ignorance on this topic anymore, especially if you're a professional company. So I am willing to give Sandfall a pass for toying around in AI back in 2022 for some minor placeholder textures, especially when this game is so clearly about the value and the emotion behind so much human-made art. But moving forwards, I'm going to be a lot less willing to forgive any game for using AI in their workflow. But yeah, to get back on topic, one of the other big excuses I've seen thrown around for using AI in game dev is to use it for a sort of concept art phase, or at least the pre-concept mood boarding phrase, if you're familiar with that term. Basically, usually when an artist is just starting out work on a new project, they'll do some research on similar settings or take a look at a variety of other art styles from other artists and whatnot, often looking at other games or movies that are in a similar genre, and then gather all of those images in one place to use as reference while they start making concept art and create the art style for the project that they are working on and will be used for the rest of that development. Now, on the surface, this sounds at least not dissimilar to how generative AI itself works in the first place, gathering up a bunch of training data to slop together something quote-unquote new. So I can see why someone might think that it isn't a terrible use case for it, especially if the actual concept art itself that you're going to be using is at least still drawn by an actual human. But here's the thing, moodboarding isn't about just finding random pictures to use as reference. There is explicit value in looking at an actual artist's work and the rest of their portfolio. Because yeah, sure, maybe if you're making a cyberpunk game and you're looking at an artist and they only have a couple of cyberpunk related images, You might think that there's no value in looking at the rest of their gallery, but if you actually looked at more of their portfolio, that might provide you with more insight into their art style. You might get more ideas from their other images that aren't cyberpunk related to inspire you to add something non-traditional to your take on the genre. After all, this is another one of the biggest general annoyances I have with AI, because it takes so many real artists and it takes work from them and everything, and it produces content based off of their work, and then it doesn't give any credit to them. So even if you like a piece of AI art, you can't then look up and go, oh, this was generated based off of XYZ artist's work. Like, let's take a look at their gallery for more reference material. And like, that just kind of sucks for artists. Like, you can't pay an artist with exposure, but that doesn't mean that we should take away what little exposure their portfolio was going to get. Like, hell, to use Expedition 33 as a more positive example in this case, they literally hired multiple people for their team based off of their random online portfolios. Like, the lead musician was literally just someone they found on some French forum who was sharing their work that they post to SoundCloud. Like, if they didn't look at real artist portfolios during those early stages of development, they might have never hired the people that made so much of the incredible art in this game in the first place. And beyond that, there's also the issue that generative AI is sort of by its nature going to end up being painfully generic. Like, sure, it's trained on the sum total of human information, but the only way for it to process that is to basically find the average of any given topic or keyword that it's given. So, for example, if you tried to look up cyberpunk concept art using generative AI, well, then you're going to end up mostly just getting whatever the most popular cyberpunk material of the time is, which in this case is probably going to be just 2077 all over the place, since that is the latest, biggest cyberpunk media to come out. So I guess if your goal is just to copy 2077, then mission accomplished, but ideally you should be drawing from more than just the most popular media for your inspiration. And not to mention, you could just look at the actual game of Cyberpunk 2077 as your reference material instead of filtering it through AI for no reason. And I mean, if you only use GenAI as your inspiration, chances are you won't get more unique takes on the genre's visuals, like say how Deus Ex Human Revolution. Like, sure, they had a pretty heavy piss filter, I'm not going to deny that, but they did at least have their own unique take on the visuals for things like cybernetics, and even incorporated certain unique elements like the Renaissance-esque filigree flair into their furniture and clothing designs that kind of gave it its own unique vibe compared to other cyberpunk settings. The point being that you'll probably never see anything like this with AI unless you specifically ask for it, but if you already know to ask for something that looks like this, then why aren't you just looking up Deus Ex to use it as a direct reference material when you could, like, filtering it through AI is just a pointless extra step that doesn't add anything. But okay, now we get to what I personally find the most annoying use of AI, and that is for vibe coding, aka using AI to write blocks of code or even entire scripts for you. Now, I'm personally a programmer by trade, so this hits closest to home for me, and my god, AI code is so annoyingly bad. Like, there's this thing about AI work that I feel almost plays into like the Dunning-Kruger effect in a sense. Basically, whenever you have an AI bro bragging about how they're using AI for their project, it's always about using it for a field that they themselves aren't experienced in. These people are always like, well, in my experience, AI isn't good enough to be used in my field yet, but it could totally be used for the fields that I'm less knowledgeable about, which results in things like coders using AI for art and artists using AI for code, and they both end up thinking this same thing, but with their respective fields swapped, which I think highlights how AI can appear competent to a layman, but when you actually show things like AI generated artwork to a real artist or AI generated code to a real coder, they're able to instantly pick it apart and point out all the various mistakes it keeps making. So yeah, like, this is me with AI code. Again, it can generate some surprisingly functional code, sure, but I would not want to touch any of this vibe coded nonsense with a 10-foot pole in any kind of professional environment. Now, coding is not exactly a great visual medium, but I'll try to explain how the problem comes in many forms. For one, AI absolutely sucks at integration. If you're working on a larger project, you're going to end up having multiple different teams writing their own code for their own parts of the project. You know, you got one person working on the player code, another person working on, enemy AI code, like, actual AI, not, generative AI, and then eventually they'll need to integrate all those different scripts and code bases to make everything work in the final product. And if you're a real coder, you can plan ahead for this and design your code in such a way that it can be integrated more easily into other people's work. Meanwhile, I have already seen numerous news stories talking about times when a team tried to use AI code and they finished their part of the project so fast and it made them look so smart and impressive and everything. But then when it actually came to integration day, suddenly none of their code would play nice with anyone else because the AI was incapable of planning ahead with that level of foresight, and they basically had to scrap it entirely and start over to make their code work with the project as a whole, because of course AI can't handle this. It's not capable of actually understanding what it's coding. It's literally just predicting the next line of code based on statistically guessing what would happen after looking at all of the other code for millions of different projects. It's not aware of good coding practices or how to optimize things, it's just blindly copying from other people's work. And that results in another big problem with vibe coding, and that's the fact that you end up losing track of your own project. There's this analogy that I love that's used to decry the use of AI for things like schoolwork, because it's like taking a forklift to the gym to lift weights for you. The point of a gym is not that these heavy weights need to be lifted up and down repeatedly. The point is that doing it yourself gets you to do exercise and makes your body healthier. And I feel like this applies to coding as well, because not only do you rob yourself of the ability to practice and, get better at coding by instead just having an AI do everything for you, but it also means that you're now a lot less familiar with the code being written and how it was written if you had instead written it yourself. So when things inevitably go wrong, because if you think you can work on a project and not encounter bugs, you are lying to yourself, then you're going to have to go back through this AI written code, not as someone who is intimately familiar with it and understands the thought process behind how it was written, but as an outsider who has to reverse engineer the non-existent thought process behind that code, which will inevitably make your life a lot harder than if you had just wrote the damn thing yourself. And in general, from experience, I and all my programmer friends can say firsthand that just AI code is just straight up dog shit. Like, the only reason why AI is capable of replicating human speech so effectively is because the language is very fluid and non-specific. There's a million different ways to construct a sentence to get across the same idea, so there's a lot more wiggle room for error and interpretation when you're just putting words on paper. But in coding, you're working with very specific rules and logic. There's a lot less room for mistakes, and that's before you even take into account the specific coding practices for the job that you're working at. Maybe for this project, you're expected to format your variables in a specific way, or they want you to write comments in a specific format and include key pieces of information about your code for the other coders to reference down the line. And that kind of stuff, AI is a lot less capable of keeping track of consistently. Every time me and my coworkers have to deal with some AI slop code from another department, we almost always ends up wasting more time trying to fix it than it would be to just rewrite it from scratch. Sometimes it'll just hallucinate entirely new variables out of nowhere that serve no purpose in the code, or try to reference functions from other scripts that don't exist yet, because again, the AI is just blindly copying from other people's work without actually understanding the context that it's being used in. Oh, and one last thing worth touching on in regards to using AI in game dev is that I've seen some companies try to claim that they'll only use an ethical version of AI, one that's trained entirely on content that they own legally and that they can run in-house without using massive data centers. Now, again, in theory, this does at least address the two biggest problems that I mentioned at the start. So again, on the surface, this seems like a good idea, but you also have to recognize that these big AIs that you know about, ChatGPT and Sora and whatnot, these are trained on billions of data harvested from every corner of the internet, every piece of art, every book, every post on Reddit, etc., etc. And despite all of that, these AIs are still so bad at so many jobs. Like, sure, I guess they're great at making clickbaity shorts, but again, I don't think that these mega AIs are viable for use in any professional industry. Even the really crappy versions of these things things that came out back in 2022. Even those versions were still trained on just absolute boatloads of data, and like I said, it was popular to dunk on how hilariously bad they were. So when you tell me that you want to try and build your own tiny micro AI from scratch in-house, that to me just shows an even greater level of ignorance on the topic, because there's no way that you have enough training data and processing power to actually get a halfway decent AI up and running from purely in-house materials. It's just a massive waste of time and effort to try and make your own version of a tool that is going to be an order of magnitude worse than anything else on the market, which was already bad to begin with. You know, either that or you're just lying, either intentionally or out of ignorance, and they're just going to use a fork of some bigger, more popular AI that was trained unethically, but is designed to be tailored based off of the local training data you feed it, which, you know, kind of defeats the whole purpose of trying to make a quote-unquote ethical AI in the first place. So yeah, there's probably some more use cases that people have brought up about AI and game dev and whatnot, but if I keep going, I am going to blow a gasket at this rate, so I should probably stop it here for today. I just really don't think that this technology is anywhere near as viable as it keeps getting portrayed, and I don't believe that it's just going to keep getting better, so it's inevitable. I mean, hell, let's be real, I think that AI is preying on the fact that it's often easier to trick a person into thinking you're good at your job than it is to actually be good at that job. Like, we've had basic chatbots for decades that were capable of talking to people long before this kind of tech came around. Hell, back in the 60s, they managed to make a computer program called Eliza that fooled people into thinking it was intelligent. And literally, all that it did was it cosplayed as a psychologist by alternating between generic questions like, is something troubling you? And otherwise rephrasing whatever you told it into the form of a question. Like, if you said, you know, my boyfriend is what's troubling me, then it would say, well, what about your boyfriend is troubling you? You know, so in my view, even if we put aside all of these massive environmental problems and the problems with plagiarism and whatnot, AI is just not fundamentally good enough to actually be used in any kind of real profession for serious work. And it only ever looks that way from the perspective of someone that clearly isn't well versed in that field, which might go to explain why so many CEOs and managers believe in AI tech so easily. But I think that will do it for now, and as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. Let me know if you've got any of your own personal experiences of the various issues with using AI in your own dev work, or really just any kind of professional work in any industry at this point. Thankfully, it seems that at least some devs, like I said, Larian, are starting to back off from their original claims about wanting to use AI, and I doubt that companies like Sandfall are ever going to use it again after all the hot water that they got into for using a simple placeholder. But to be frank, I just want this bubble to finally pop and for this all go away. It's just so annoying to be constantly getting fed all of this slop being pushed to us every single day. But for now, if you like the video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe if you want to see more content like this in the future, and if you want to support the channel more directly, and myself as an actual human being instead of as an AI, there is a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.